Good evening, and thank you all for being here. It's we were just saying we got a full demonstration of the scope and power of the Chicago weather, full range today. But thank you for coming out, and this is just the best. So it's truly a pleasure for me to welcome you to the 2024 Nora and Edward Ryerson Lecture, which of course today will feature Jonathan Lear, who is the John U. Neff Distinguished Service Professor and serves in the John U. Neff Committee on Social Thought, as well as being in the Department of Philosophy and of course the college. This wonderful lecture was established in 1973 by the Board of Trustees with the support of a bequest made by former chairman of the board, Edward L. Ryerson, along with his wife, Nora Ryerson. And it is truly a cherished and very special event in our institution. It's a celebrated event, and that's because it really signifies a celebration of what makes this university great, of the academic culture that permeates this place in every way. I like to think about the culture, the deep academic culture of this university in terms of asking the question, who in a given society, who in a culture is the most honored person? And in our culture, I believe the most honored person is the scholar, the thinker, who very carefully over time peels back layer by layer, carefully, down to the deepest level to expose new ways of thinking and new knowledge. That's what animates this whole community. And therefore, it's essential that we periodically have an opportunity to come together and celebrate when that has occurred, and to celebrate those who do it. And so that's what the Ryerson Lecture truly is all about. And I think today we'll see that in evidence. Now, how would we know? And another aspect of the Ryerson Lecture that reflects this culture, this spectacular culture that's here, is that it is the faculty as a group, as a community, who judge this. So that when we confer this honor, when we celebrate a scholar in this way, we know that it's truly an expression of the community, because it is a committee of the faculty who so carefully take the time to do this. And they've done it very well. Professor Lear's scholarship concerns philosophical dimensions of the human psyche, as well as ethical implications that stem from our human nature. Jonathan holds degrees from Cambridge University and Rockefeller University, where he earned his PhD, which is kind of strange when you think about it. But he further honed his expertise by undergoing psychoanalytic training at the Western New England Institute for Psychoanalysis. Now, I'm in conversations quite frequently with Jonathan, and I can never tell which of all those perspectives he's using to bore in on me, but I can tell you, I approach those conversations very carefully. His scholarly contributions have garnered widespread acclaim, including his receipt of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award. He has held the esteemed position of the Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society here at the university. And I just want to take a moment and speak about that, because the Neubauer Collegium has this role of bringing faculty from diverse parts of the university together to think about really critical issues that connect the humanities with the university as a whole. And Jonathan served in that role in a way that affected the lives of many, many faculty all across the university. And so I think we owe him some gratitude for that role. But also, when I was still just beginning to get to know Jonathan, I had literally just arrived, he said he was going to be leaving this role. And when I asked why everybody thinks things are going so splendidly, he said, well, I've contributed for a number of years, and I feel like it's time for the university to have someone else to come in to help to lead it. And I think that's a form of wisdom and also a form of the kinds of humility that he brings to his engagement inside the university. He is a Distinguished Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of course, a member of the American Philosophical Society. Jonathan invites us to delve deeply into issues of philosophy and how they are intertwined with everyday life and cultural nuances. I got to know him also when he shared with me the first chapter, as it was still being written, of his book, Imagining the End. And it's just such a delight to read that, because it starts with just an everyday moment in which somebody makes a joke in the middle of an interaction at the university. And then he proceeds to try to explain to us why that joke was so funny. What was it that made it resonate so strongly with people? And it turns out it lays bare all of the moral understandings that underlay that particular area, which you can imagine. Imagining the end. It's pretty serious stuff. So it's just remarkable. And he teaches us something else, which is how to engage with the past, but not nostalgically. I remember him telling me in one of our conversations, we should deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. But also his acknowledgement of human limitations and the acceptance of uncertainty. And yet he always advises a notion of radical hope. It's amazing. So I think it's going to be a really wonderful lecture tonight. I'm excited about it. And I think that in choosing Jonathan Lear, the committee has indeed honored the deep culture of this university. Jonathan.
Thank you. It's just a delight to be here with you. So we are creatures whose lives are permeated with meaning. Our lives are constituted by actions, thoughts, and interactions with others, and the forms of life that are available in our historical period in society. All of this is meaningful. But meanings are themselves vulnerable, and we inevitably inherit that vulnerability. In fact, vulnerability to meaning goes to the heart of who we are. So a question arises that is basically ethical. Are there better and worse ways of living with our shared vulnerability? Now, this is the question I've been thinking about over the years, and my work has found a home in a kind of intersection of logic and ontology, ethics and culture, and a currently unfashionable form of psychology known as psychoanalysis. And this evening, I want to approach the question of vulnerability from three angles. There they are. Vulnerability from the outside, and vulnerability from the inside, and vulnerability to aporia of absolute value. And the word aporia is like a word for getting stuck, puzzled. I'll talk about that later. Now, I don't think any of these names are particularly good, but they'll get us started. And I'm going to also start telling you about work I've done over the years, but I'm going to end by telling you about work that is very much at the early beginning stages. So, vulnerability from the outside. In the beginning was a humanities center lunch. Decades ago, I was a young professor at Yale, and I went to a humanities center lunch and heard the historian William Cronin talk about his work and progress. And he quoted Plenty Coups, chief of the Crow Nation, about their move onto the reservation. After the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground. We could not pick them up again. After this, nothing happened. Those words struck me at the time and even sickened me. But lunch was over. I returned to my life until about 15 years later, when I was now in Chicago and taking a walk down Lake Michigan. And that phrase came back to me as if from nowhere. And this time I didn't let it go. First, I was influenced by Socrates, whose life was committed to the idea that philosophy can arise anywhere, from a chance conversation. And in speaking to a biographer, Plenty Coups had started a conversation. And I felt some kind of weird call to respond somehow. And second, I had trained by then as a psychoanalyst. And psychoanalysts pay attention to things that just pop into our heads. One of Freud's patients called them the uninvited guests. So my book, Radical Hope, aims to be a work of philosophy, but the genre is unusual. The book explores an imaginative possibility. What if Plenty Coups were standing witness to the truth? Was there a this, such that after it, things ceased to happen? Now notice this is not a psychological claim, but an ontological one. Plenty Coups was not saying that it was as though things ceased to happen. He was saying that things ceased to happen. And can we make sense of the idea that for a people, things can stop happening, even though they continue to live and to act? So the book was an essay in a kind of philosophical imagination, but it was also an attempt to pay respect. Plenty Coups, as I understood him, was standing witness to the devastation of their form of life. The Crow were actually, and they're also known as the Apsalika people, the Crow were allies of the United States. And thus they did not suffer the familiar physical horrors and psychological traumas of military defeat. But they were a nomadic people, so that by confining them to a reservation and shutting down tribal hunts and warfare, the US devastated the meaningfulness of Crow life. The unity of Crow life had consisted in everything being understood in a larger context of nomadic life, going on hunts, and going into battle. And even daily routines like cooking a meal or mending a teepee were understood as preparing for or contributing to that form of life. But those larger meaning-lending concepts were no longer possible ways to live. And so regardless of what any individual Crow person might have thought or wanted, these traditional forms of life were no longer possible. Consider, for example, the traditional activities of bravery known as counting coup. Planting a coup stick in battle, striking an enemy with it, or stealing horses from an enemy camp. With the destruction of possibilities for battle, the possibility of counting coup was devastated. But counting coup was central to according honor and recognition. Now events, and here you'll keep hearing Aristotle is one of my real teachers. Events, Aristotle teaches us, are to be understood in terms of now, when. For instance, now, when we are here together at the Ryerson Lecture. This is not about subjective interpretation, what interpretation you give or I give. It's about a form of life shaping what actually is. The Ryerson Lecture is, as we've just heard, part of an institution and culture of the University of Chicago. And we, here and now, are participating in that culture. But suppose the very institution of universities were to go out of existence. This is an historical possibility. There's all the difference in the world between there was no Ryerson lecture because Jonathan fell ill, and there was no Ryerson lecture because there is no longer a University of Chicago. In the latter case, the form of life which lends meaning to there being any such thing as a Ryerson lecture would be gone. And for many of us in this room, I think many of us in this room, it would become problematic what we were any longer doing, even if we were left standing with possibilities of food, shelter, and sexual reproduction. For the crow, if nothing any longer could count as preparing to go into battle, or preparing for a hunt, or preparing for a nomadic journey, then the crow way of life ran out of whens. This would make comprehensible Plenty Coux's claim that there was a this, such that after this, nothing happened. This is what it is to devastate a world, yet leave the inhabitants standing. And my work has tried to shed light on this special kind of harm to form, that can get overlooked as we concentrate on more obvious harm to individuals. For example, psychological trauma, physical harm, or poverty. And as we try to get clearer about our own anxieties, whether about the world at large or about the university, it is helpful to have the idea of harm to form in mind. This is a harm that can escape our notice even as we try to understand our own condition. Plenty Coux led his people through these difficult times, and I imagine his actions as manifesting radical hope. Now, what makes hope radical is not that it is extreme, but that it lacks the concepts with which to specify it. One could say that Plenty Coux hoped for, a return to crow life, but this was not a hope for a kind of magical return to a previous historical era with the buffalo back and white men never having arrived. Rather, it was for some kind of reanimation of life that would simultaneously be new and yet also recognizably crow. But that new form of life, when he spoke those words, was not yet in place. So the idea of a new crow way of living was essentially indefinite. Radical hope is not optimism. It is not an expectation that things will go well. It is the maintenance of hope that things will go well in a period when one can no longer specify what that means. Now, I must be brief, but I want to tell you about a visit of 70 Crow Apsaalooka guests to the University of Chicago. About 20 years ago, in 2004, I made a trip to the Crow Reservation. I knew no one. I had no formal introductions. And in an important sense, I had no plans. I didn't really know what I was doing. I certainly did not want to study the crow. I knew that. I just wanted to see if anybody would meet with me and talk. So the people I met back then, it has turned out, are now my friends of 20 years. And except for the pandemic, I've been making trips to the reservation most years, and sometimes my family would come too. One summer, actually a Hyde Parker lent us a house in the Wolf Mountains up on the Crow Reservation. And Crow people would come to visit. My son, Sam, who's 16 now and in the audience, was then 6 months. He couldn't yet walk, but he was on a crow horse before he could walk. And as director of the Neubauer Collegium, I did everything I could to bring native artists and writers and tribal elders from all over the US and Canada to the University of Chicago. And Crow friends would come too. We had conferences, art exhibitions, visiting fellows. We drew in University of Chicago faculty and students, and also invited in museum curators and art collectors. Now, one upshot of this was this magnificent Apsaalooka Women and Warriors exhibition, jointly sponsored by the Neubauer Collegium and the Field Museum of Natural History. And so many people across so many dimensions contributed this and to make it happen. I just want to, though, mention Elspeth Carruthers, who's in the audience, part of the staff, the executive director of the Neubauer Collegium, along with Mark Sorkin, Dieter Rollstrater, Jennifer Hellman, and Jessica Musselwhite, who was then on the staff. That on this side, and countless people on the Crow side and at the Field Museum made this happen. This was the first exhibition in the Field Museum's history, where the curator was Native American. It is also the first exhibition that was not just nostalgic and retrospective and backward-looking. Nina Sanders, the curator, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, insisted that the exhibition contained contemporary work of many young Crow artists. And as you will hear in a moment, this was the first exhibition in which Crow people felt they got to tell their story. Now, some of you may remember, but many of you may not know, that the Apsaalooka people held a parade right here on the university campus. And I want to show you a short clip. It's 2 minutes and 45 seconds, but I'd like you to see this. And please listen carefully. The visual is great, but please listen carefully to what the people are saying. Some of you are in it.
And everything that we do, we start with a prayer. I call it talking to the ultimate source of energy.
Apsaalooka people, Itchik Dalom. It's good you are here. Welcome to the University of Chicago.
An honor to be able to be in this entire movement. You know, Nina is just so intelligent. She has such foresight and leadership. Today we had a parade, and when we parade as Crow people, we're going to a new place, an encampment with many blessings, and Nina's leading us to that new place, a place of many blessings with our spiritual ways, our customs, our language, and our traditions. Aho, Nina.
It's the first time in history that this kind of exhibit recognizing the Apsaalooka ladies have been displayed to the world of this magnitude. My Aunt Nina Sanders, she has gained a coup as a warrior lady with her knowledge, education, and anthropology. And you've seen it, you experienced it.
So, if you listened and heard it, Sean Reelbird, who was speaking at the end, said that Nina Sanders made a coup. He also calls her a warrior. And he's right. There were real struggles to get that show up, and Nina did triumph. There is so much to say about that, but the point for now is that Plenty-Coup in his time would not have imagined an art exhibition as an instance of counting coup. But if he were here for this event, I believe he would have had no trouble in recognizing it as just that. And when Dr. Pease says, "Aho, Nina, thank you," it is an expression of gratitude for help in reanimating a Crow way of life in ways that are at once traditional and new. And this, I think, is what it looks like for radical hope to cease to be radical in its nature and again to gain definition and determination. Okay, part two, vulnerability from the inside. We are also vulnerable to meanings that in some sense are of our own making and shape our world, yet they also escape our understanding. During the decade I was a professor of philosophy at Yale, I decided to train as a psychoanalyst. Now, this may sound strange to you, and in some sense it is, but my study of ancient Greek ethics had led me to think that the unfinished business of Plato and Aristotle was to understand better how the rational and non-rational parts of the psyche might work together. I had a hunch that if Socrates or Aristotle were alive, they would want to find out about psychoanalysis. And Socrates, I think, would be especially interested in the essentially first personal aspect of psychoanalytic work. Now, in a funny way, psychoanalytic technique is an extension of Socratic method. The paradigm of Socratic inquiry is a two-person conversation in which each person is asked to state what they believe. This is the realm of giving reasons. By contrast, Freud's so-called, he called it the fundamental rule, is to state out loud whatever comes into your mind, whether you believe it or not. In effect, psychoanalysis has given us a different meaning to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and free inquiry than we're used to at the University of Chicago. For 50 minutes, take a break from what you normally do in classrooms, conferences, speeches, and lectures, and say whatever it is that comes into your mind. And if you have no reasons, all the better. If you think it's really silly and stupid and not what you really think, that's even better than that. Just say what comes into your mind wherever it goes. And it's a quite remarkable empirical discovery that no one can follow the fundamental rule. People keep interrupting themselves, changing tack, falling silent, inhibiting themselves. And psychoanalysis emerges by working with these failures. It has been invaluable for me to have done full clinical training, for it enabled me to formulate a position different from Freud, which I could never have done by reading alone. Now, although Freud named the fundamental rule, he actually didn't live by it. He was too fascinated by discovering the hidden wish in someone else's unconscious. By contrast, I have tried to live by the fundamental rule and to think of the psychoanalytic unconscious not in terms of any theory, but as that which emerges from this method. The psychoanalyst's job is not to tell anyone what is going on in their minds, but rather to facilitate a process in which analysans can speak their own minds. And what I have discovered is best understood not as hidden wishes or contents, but rather forms of thinking and acting that are all around us, but not recognized as such. These forms close us off from life's possibilities while making us think that we are open to the world. So, quick example, Ms. A lived in what I came to recognize as a disappointing world. She would emphasize real-life disappointments, but even when successes occurred, like a promotion at work or someone asking her out to dinner, there would be some disappointing spin. And it usually took the form of a triangle. My boss has given me a promotion, but he had to because he really wanted to promote this other person, and he couldn't do it without promoting me as well. Or he probably invited me out because Y is away. Disappointment was experienced as a fate. Sorry, where are we? Oh, wrong way, sorry. Whoopsie. Yeah. In effect, thank you, I like that. Disappointment was experienced as a fate. In effect, Ms. A was imposing an imaginative a priori in which she was unaware, in which disappointment was lending form to her experience. And each disappointment was this kind of petite triangle, but put together, they formed a kind of geodesic dome of disappointment that she experienced as all the reality there is. So the unconscious was showing up in the form of her thinking, and that is part of why it's so difficult to recognize. And also, I'll just say, I think psychoanalysis works not by any kind of theoretical abstraction about who you are or what you're like, but actually getting into each triangle in a living way and taking it apart triangle by triangle. And although I'll just say, you know, philosophy and psychoanalysis differ, they have it in common that both, I think, try to look at forms and see forms where they can. And forms are harder to grasp than contents. They're just harder to see. So at first it looks like no one would want to suffer disappointment after disappointment. But the hidden success, you might say, of Mizet's strategy is that in fantasy, no one can disappoint her because she gets there first and disappoints herself. She triumphs over a sense of vulnerability by vaguely knowing ahead of time that all possibilities are covered. They're going to be disappointing. And in this sense, neurosis is the antithesis of radical hope. Now, it's only recently that I've come to realize that in neurosis, the capacity for gratitude goes missing. In my clinical practice, I have done low-fee work. I've seen patients who cannot afford it. Now, it's not unusual for analyzans at some point to express guilt or anxiety that they cannot afford to pay more. When I was doing it, I was working on that. You know, why do you feel guilty, or what are you anxious about? But it's only recently I've come to wonder whether guilt and anxiety are substitutes for gratitude. That it's somehow easier to feel guilty or anxious than to feel grateful. And this has made me curious about gratitude and the place of gratitude in our lives. I've also been curious about gratitude in a larger cultural context, and Paul started to talk about that a bit earlier. We now all share the fear that catastrophe is coming our way, whether by climate catastrophe, political turmoil, war, nuclear catastrophe, or pandemic. And these threats are all very real. There's very good reason to be worried. And yet, at the same time, these real threats put tremendous pressure on our imaginations. Now, this is anecdotal, but I have repeatedly heard remarks that we deserve what's coming, that we are such greedy and selfish and destructive animals. It's as though the speaker can sort of savor the prospect of justice finally achieved. We're done. Now, no doubt we are problematic animals. But again, I think I can hear the imaginative allure of a disappointing world. To take satisfaction, even in a moment, in the idea of humanity finally getting its comeuppance requires in that moment that we forget about the beautiful, generous, creative contributions that humans have made. It is a refusal to experience a sense of loss, at least in that moment, at the prospect of losing all the goodness that humans have ever created. Now, in the past, I've characterized that as a refusal to mourn. I'm now trying to think about it as the shutdown of a capacity for gratitude. So here is a tentative hypothesis and a puzzle. When we are under imaginative pressure of various kinds, there is a tendency for our capacity for gratitude to go missing. We've already looked at one, and just begun to look at one strategic advantage, the desire in fantasy to render ourselves invulnerable and to avoid acknowledgement of dependence on others. But this evening, I want to go down a different route and ask, what do we lose if we lose the capacity for gratitude? And this brings us to our third and last realm of vulnerability, which is the vulnerability of aporia to absolute value. We lose, I think, this is my answer of what we lose is a bit ironic, but it's also completely earnest. I think we lose the opportunity to experience a fundamental conflict in the human condition. So, this, our third vulnerability, is a vulnerability to getting stuck when it comes to goodness. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the word aporia. It's actually turned into an English word over the past 800 years, but it's a Greek word. It came from the Greek, and the is a privative. It just means we don't have it. No, not. And poria is like passage. So it's getting stuck. It's a lack of passage. It's puzzlement. Socrates called it thus. It was sort of not seeing a way out. And I think we get stuck when it comes to goodness. And here are two steps that I think we take that gets us stuck. One, the first step, is that gratitude leads us to think that we are justified in our judgments of goodness. But then secondly, philosophical reflection convinces us that we cannot make sense of what we are thinking. Now, it might first seem that this vulnerability is a peculiar hazard of doing philosophy, and it may be that too, but I think it goes to the heart of the human condition. These are thoughts I'm just beginning to work out, so let me share them with you. So first, the claim that gratitude leads us to think that we're justified in our judgments of goodness. And here again, I take inspiration from Aristotle. Let's start with a very simple case. So, emotions are feelings. You can measure heartbeat rate and, blood pulse, and Aristotle was interested in all of that. But really at the heart of it is emotions paradigmatically facilitate transitions from a less good situation to a better one. So start at the top left. There's a prior event, which is a threat, and my emotion arises, which is fear. And I respond to the emotion by flight and avoidance, and if all works out well, safety is restored. And ditto with the prior event is you've insulted me or injured me, I get angry, I seek revenge or punishment or rectification, and justice, if it all goes well, is restored. And this is incredibly important, that the emotions also make a claim for their own legitimacy. Angry people feel justified in their anger, and fearful people feel justified in their fear. And more than that, when we think about where does this justification come from, or the sense of justification, emotions function, again, as a form of thinking, rather like a rule of inference. And this is a source of justification. So consider, this is what I'll call the fear syllogism. And it's important that it's first personal. It's a practical syllogism. There's a bear coming at me. It would be horrible to be attacked. There is a car. There is a cabin. The car is closer. I jump in the car. Practical syllogisms are not about an area, the practical. They're a form of thinking, practically thinking. And so the conclusion of this line of thinking is jumping in the car. That's, Aristotle said, we conclude our practical thinking, our syllogizing, with an action. Fear, and this is so fascinating. At least I think you'll find this fascinating as you think about it. This is easier. It's not as easy as it looks. Or it's, that where's fear? Well, in some sense, it's nowhere. It doesn't occur on the list, and yet it's everywhere. It's structuring all the thinking. It's there at every step. It guides how I pick out the salient items around me. It lends a sense of legitimacy to what follows from what. And as you can see, fear isn't functioning as a premise in the syllogism. It's not explicitly stated because fear is not itself a reason. But fear is everywhere present as the form of thinking. This is what it is to be thinking fearfully. Now, of course, emotions, as we well know, often distort our judgment. And we're rightly concerned about that. So, for example, we might fear something that isn't really a threat, or we might get angry about an imaginary insult, and our thinking is distorted by thoughts of revenge or escape. And this is what Aristotle called making a straight edge crooked. But when think about the times when emotional life is in good shape, when it's going well, when a person's character and judgment are healthy. Think about people that Aristotle called practically wise, aphronomoi. Emotions are not absent, they are present as appropriate. And for such people, the straight edge of their judgment is truly straight. And when they are in a dangerous situation, fear, the right amount, lends form to their thinking. So then, that's the introduction. What form of thinking does gratitude facilitate? And again, I think it's helpful to start with Aristotle, who in a way sets up the conditions for the puzzle. Here is a definition of gratitude. It's done indirectly via a favor. He said, let a favor, or charis, think charity, let a favor then, in the sense in which the person who has received it is said to be grateful, karinechen, be a service provided to one in need, not in return for anything, nor in order that the provider gets something, but in order that the recipient gets something. So I put the Greek in just so you might enjoy one little piece, that the favor, which is the charis, and then being great, in Greek, the being grateful is literally having the charis. So you give the gift, and the being grateful is the having of the thing. Anyways, it's in the Greek, it's fun, whatever. Enjoy it if you will. But the real reason that this is up here is because of the last part of the quotation in bold, which is being grateful is an appropriate response to a very special kind of favor, one that is given for the sake of the recipient and with no expectation of return. This is a very special notion. Gratitude, and this is, as you know, we can use the word gratitude in a family of ways, but this is the one we're going to try and zero in on. Gratitude must somehow acknowledge that the favor, you might say, transcends the ordinary economies of fairness, reciprocity, and justice. Here's another diagram. This is, I think, of the ordinary economy of reciprocity, which is, prior need. Today is my birthday. Actually, it turns out today is my mother's birthday. I mean, she's dead, but I'm kind of astonished to see this here. In response, somebody understands it's my birthday. They throw me a party. They give me a card. They give me a present. And my emotion, I put gratitude in quotes because this is the sort of ordinary social form. And later on, I remember their birthday. I give them a card a year later or whenever it's their birthday. Or prior condition is we're hunger. There's some kind of a this is all in single quotes. The response is I bring you over to dinner. You're grateful. You bring wine, or you invite me back. And people can love it. It's very important. I'm not disparaging it in any way. I think it's a wonderful form of sociality. But what I want to say, you don't yet have captured the gratitude that Aristotle was describing. This can be very lovely and loving and friendly, but there's a kind of economy of reciprocation. So we are creatures who can engage in sophisticated forms of reciprocation, and much can be pleasant and beneficial to us all. And we do use the language of gratitude and thank you, and we can be sincere. But we don't yet have a social world in which benefit for the sake of the other with no expectation of return shows up. When we feel gratitude, that is the condition that Aristotle defined, we experience something more here in the giving and in the receiving, and it needs somehow to be captured. With proper gratitude, both parties understand, acknowledge, and welcome that they're in a different kind of human relationship, that one that may have the conditions of justice and fairness and reciprocity in them, but they've got something more as well. And this is the question of where, what this recognition of transcendence is and what it leads to. And there you can see the puzzles. I actually think one could write a book trying to fill out those question marks. And I think I might try, but not tonight. I'm going to instead, it's an extraordinarily complicated task, and I'm only going to present this evening one very small fragment. And that's the place of gratitude in memory. Gratitude is a manner of standing witness. Part of what it is to live a distinctively human life is, from time to take stock of it. How it has been going, what matters in life, what has mattered, what should continue to matter. This is a characteristic human activity. We take stock of life in the midst of life. And in the midst of life, we recognize we're trying to grasp the meaning of an indefinite and not yet completed whole. We do not know when or how we will die, or what later events, especially catastrophes or major reversals, might be occasion for a retrospective reevaluation of what things have meant. And gratitude, I want to say, is a way of making a commitment to meaningfulness, that this gift has mattered and that it shall continue to matter in the midst of a life that we cannot fully comprehend. So for the next step of the argument, I'm going to urge you to consult your own experience and memory as we go along. For the argument, I think, is only really persuasive if you can experience it yourself first personally. Let me take the example of teachers. For I suspect many of us are grateful to 1 or 2 or 3 teachers from our past. These are the teachers who were themselves in love with what they were teaching. They wanted to pass the joy of learning on to their students. Now, they may have had a personal interest in their students, perhaps you, but maybe not. What they passed on was a love of learning, an appreciation of the beauty and importance of a subject matter or method of inquiry, an opening up of a new world of possibilities. In a funny way, their favor or gift or charis was themselves. Themselves in the activity of being themselves, doing what they loved most and allowing us to experience them as exemplary and make of it what we will. Remembering such teachers gratefully is part of what it is to take stock of one's own life. And it's only looking back from the perspective of lived time that one can understand how much that initial gift has come to mean. No thank you back at the time could possibly encompass all that that original act of generosity has come to mean. In remembering gratefully, we experience the appropriateness of keeping the grateful memory alive. And this is something beyond personal sentiment. It seems important, a commitment to keep alive a memory of real goodness. So here's an example from my life. Please take an example from yours. Decades ago, when I was a young man, Dr. Timothy Smiley, a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, opened up the world of logic for me. And philosophy did begin in wonder for me. Even now, when I think that somehow from P, and if P then Q, you can get to Q, I'm just delighted, and I'm amazed all over again. His inspiration and generosity and sympathy have turned out to be lifelong gifts. And I also had the opportunity to see him extending his generosity to others over decades and to keep a brilliant research career alive. I want to say something like, he is such a good person. And this isn't just a report of my desires. It seems to me right and appropriate and even called for. I want to say that in gratitude, I've come to a conclusion. But where does that thought lead? Now, I want to say, and this is now trying out something, I want to say that profound gratitude leads, by the very force of its own thinking, to a condition that I want to call radical gratitude. That is, a condition in which we necessarily lack the concepts to fill out what we mean. And here I am indebted to the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein in his lecture on ethics, and he was influenced by G.E. Moore. But I'm going to try and take a slightly different tack. In saying someone is a good person or a good human being, at least when saying that as an expression of profound gratitude, I am trying to say something more than that he can be explicated by any list of empirical conditions. This is different from expressions that may at first sound similar, like she's a good violinist, he's a good swimmer, they're a good poker player. In each of these cases, we can set out empirical criteria of evaluation in relationship to which these people rise to the top. But when thinking gratefully, we come to the conclusion that she is such a good person, we want to say something more. We can lay out empirical conditions that give us reasons, say her kindness or generosity or inspiration, and we can keep the list going by saying that kind and generous people promote social harmony, and so on. But it seems to me that in the expression of profound gratitude, we are trying to get at something that transcends the relative criteria of goodness. We want to say that it's good to be a good person, that it's good to be kind and generous, that it's good to promote social harmony. And in each of those emphasized uses of good, we want to get at something more than relative value. And this is what Wittgenstein called an expression of absolute value. And it shows up for me when I find myself wanting to say things like, good, period, or the world is a better place. But when we try to explain ourselves more, we find ourselves moving in quite a small circle of terms, like a really meaningful life, a truly good life, a really valuable life. And with each of those phrases, there's some indeterminacy that's essential to it. Wittgenstein called it nonsense. Yet, he also believed about this nonsense that claims to absolute value express what he called a fundamental tendency in the human. Indeed, he says that his whole tendency is to move in that direction. And so too he says that it is the tendency of everyone who has ever wanted to talk about ethics and religion. It is a tendency that he says, quote, he cannot help but respecting deeply, unquote. Well, gratitude shows us, I think, that there's more to this fundamental tendency than being a mere tendency. Moths have a tendency to fly to the flame. The human tendency, when it's informed by gratitude, manifests itself in a line of thinking that commends a sense of its own rational legitimacy. And it's important that we understand ourselves not just as subject to a tendency, as, like subject to binge eating, but as thoughtfully responsive to experience. And among other things, it is in thought that our tendency is expressed. I think it's also important to distinguish the overall conclusion that Wittgenstein reaches about our ability to express absolute value from the pathos of the images that he uses. He calls it, quote, running against the walls of our cage, unquote, and he says it is, quote, perfectly, absolutely hopeless, unquote. But whence the cage? Whence the walls? And why characterize our activity as running up against them? These images seem to me optional. And he also repeats the locution of running against. The second time it's running against, quote, the boundaries of our language. The repetition of the phrase is rhetorically stirring, not unlike an incantation. So, to my eyes and ears, and call me a psychoanalyst, there seems to me to be a kind of imaginative a priori at work in the images, an interpretive structure in which the author creates for the reader an aura of frustration, enclosure, inability to escape, hopelessness. And there's a tone of severity, which suggests that if one does not accept the pathos, one has not accepted the conclusion. My suspicion is that these are false images of necessity and actually a kind of geodesic dome of frustration. It seems to me that one can accept the overall movement of Wittgenstein's argument, yet have more freedom to play with the images. Rigorous thinking leads us in conflicting directions. Gratitude leads us to conclude we ought to recognize absolute value. Philosophical critique leads us to recognize that we cannot make determinate sense of what we are thinking. Why not inherit this in the mode of comedy? I am reminded of that ancient philosopher who once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Now, by ancient, I mean mid-20th century, and yes, in his spare time, he played catcher for the New York Yankees. Instead of a cage that we are running up against, why not a fork in the road, one path following relative value, the other seeking absolute? Somehow, we need to take the fork. It seems to me that shutting down gratitude is an effective means of shutting down the experience of that fork. And I think experiencing that very tension is crucial to the human. So let me illustrate this with some concluding thoughts about the University of Chicago. The goodness of a good university is more like the goodness of a good human being than it is like the goodness of a good factory. Of course, we do and must set out relative criteria in relation to which some universities rank better than others. Publications in peer-ranked journals, awards to faculty, quality of students measured by empirical criteria, and so on. We can also posit basic goals that we think are good to achieve and which we think the university as a knowledge-seeking institution might contribute. For example, climate stability, social justice, eliminating poverty, public health, safety, and world peace. And we can measure how well we are doing in creating the knowledge needed to achieve these goals. This is the realm in which the concept of impact has its home. And this is good. It's very good as far as it goes. But I do not think this is all we mean, or at least try to mean, when we say the University of Chicago is a great university. Even within the arena of impact, we don't just want impact, we want good impact. You know, I suspect our scientists, if they set their minds to it, could destroy life on Earth. And our social scientists could develop social media that poison human minds with prejudice and fear. Now that is transformative, collaborative impact. But it's not what we seek. But what is good impact? Can we say anything more than give a list? Moreover, think of all the activities at this university that are good in themselves, regardless of impact. These are pursuits of truth and understanding, of honesty, insight, rigorous thinking, memory, beauty, and creativity. That they are happening at all is wonderful. And if they led to other goods, that would be great. But these further goods are not what justifies them. I want to say that part of what makes this university great is that it promotes all of these activities for their own sakes, irrespective of outcome, and because they are good, period. So here I am at my very own fork in the road. I want to express gratitude to you, my faculty colleagues, students, administrators, staff, and trustees, all of you who constitute the University of Chicago community. I've just given you some reasons why, and I can give a few more. The friendliness of this community, our openness to different points of view, our collective honesty, our welcome to the oddball, our skepticism of common knowledge, our commitment to figuring things out. But in being grateful for all of that, I find I'm grateful for more than that. I want to say that pursuing all these goods is really, truly good. As a university, we make mistakes, we commit injustices, we can be wildly off target and historically confused and need correction. But when we are on target, I want to say the university contributes to the universe, at least this corner of it. Now, your task is to make what you will of what I'm about to say, which is, I want to thank you for all of that. Thank you. Thank you. Far back.
You mentioned that fear comes from thinking. So what generates gratitude?
What generates gratitude is that you remember the definition by Aristotle, the giving of the favor. And this is the one again, the word gratitude can be used in a family of ways, and I don't want to say, they're all good uses. But the one I wanted to focus in on was the one that Aristotle isolated, which is, he defines the favor with a particular condition, which is not in return for anything, but in order that the recipient gets something. The provider gives something. I'm sorry, that's not. It's a kind of no strings attached. And the gratitude has got to be, I think, if it's an appropriate response, it's got somehow in its expression to acknowledge, I get it. There are no strings attached. That's part of what my gratitude consists in. Okay. So that's, I think, the short answer to the.
Got it. Thank you very much.
You bet, sir. Yes.
Thank you.
Tori, please.
Your framing of these issues in terms of meaning and the vulnerability of meaning got me thinking about the turn of phrase that was very much common currency when I was working at a Quaker school, and that I hear a lot among younger generations, truth. Speaking one's truth. And I wonder if there's a relationship between the vulnerability of one's meaning and that experience that I think young people are really seeking of what is their truth, what is my truth, and what do we do when my truth conflicts with yours? I don't know if there's any connection there.
I think it's huge. But I mean, I am steeped in the ancient Greek philosophical way of thinking about these. Let me just say out loud, that for Aristotle and for Plato, there's no way we can successfully enter the ethical world without certain kinds of habituation into it. And what we, this is what I would, we need to figure out, culturally figure out as a culture how to bring our young people in via habits. Because what we need to do is somehow educate what they call the non-rational part of the soul, which Aristotle says, in a way it listens to reason, but in a way not. And if you, so part of the challenge is figuring out fair, as you would put it, truthful ways of bringing people, developing their character so that they are then responsive to reasons. But you can't just start at the level of reasons, or you get, what Aristotle thought empty talk. And so, I mean, this is a huge challenge in a 21st century democracy. It's not, but I think they're getting at something very real, which is what are the fair means of educating us into psychic health. Psychic health, that the non-rational and the rational parts of the soul can work in a sufficient harmony so as to be able to be responsive to reasons. But that means you can't, I mean, from that Greek perspective, it can't just be, whatever it happens to seem to me as I wake up at, 16, 17, 18 years old, or, whatever, and just discuss it. It's got to be, I mean, the dangers that, well, Plato was certainly very worried about would be the dangers of like being brought up in the idea of being brought up in an oligarchy, for instance, or what he thought, he thought democracy was a big problem because people can be brought up to think that what they basically are consumers. And so their truth becomes, would I buy that? And, when I hear my students say, I don't buy that, it really, it sets me off because I think they actually mean much more than they even realize they mean. Anyways, that's a start of but please, go, do you want to say something more, Tori?
No, thank you. I'll noodle on that.
I'll just say, there's an image in the Greek world, and I think we need, one of the things I think we need to, really think about how to change it to make it more available in our world. But the Greek world thought that, you were educated by habit and training and then by argument into a healthy condition of the human psyche, which is, they called, translated into English, they called it virtue. It's not a great, it's a kind of human flourishing, a distinctively human flourishing. And the challenge is to, I think, to correct for various anti-democratic and elitist presuppositions of ancient Greek thinking, but hold on to the view that we do need to educate people into a kind of wholeness of flourishing, that exactly how we do it is, I think, exactly what the lab school should be working on and putting forward as a leadership role.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take with me the idea of harmonizing the rational and the non-rational. It seems to me that we still struggle as a society with how to help young people connect with, in a wonderful environment like this, I think we're great at helping them connect with their rational thinking. And I don't know that we've yet learned how to help them connect with their intuition in a way that is supportable and sustainable and in dialogue with the other. That horse is out of the barn, and I'm not sure where it's going.
Thank you. Please, Rainey.
My question is about a possible obstacle to feeling gratitude, which is the sense that it's undeserved. So we often think that misfortune is undeserved. Yet so many things, when I think of my own life, are the amount of good luck, sheer good luck, of being born at a certain time, of unprecedented peace and prosperity, of a time when public education was available. These are all completely undeserved. There's an element of injustice in my good fortune, and yet I have a vague sense of gratitude for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a feeling that perhaps many people have.
Yeah.
That makes gratitude problematic.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And the problem is the problem of living with it. And, you know, I think the kinds of, I've really focused in on just one thread of a very complex story, I think, about gratitude. But I think the point you're making, I really agree with, that it's difficult at least for many, in many ways, it can be very difficult to experience gratitude. And other things just seem preferable and more of a kind of relief. Just easier to deal with. And it's funny, we have an institution within the Committee on Social Thought where we have a regular lunch that the faculty give a kind of intellectual autobiography to the grad students. Grad students are very interested in, how the faculty got to their lives and whatever. And we've had this series of lunches. It's quite informal, very friendly, where the faculty said, how do they get to be there, And it's a very, I've been going to these lunches for years, and a thread that, the stories are so different, but there's a thread running through them that everybody experiences their good fortune as wildly contingent and very, very meaningful. And like it might well not have happened. And I think that's all correct, but it's also quite striking to me that everybody has that thought. It might be true, but when people tell the story of their lives to, the next generation, that's the thought that comes up very consistently. And I think that's, one can celebrate it, one can be delighted in it, one can feel responsibility for it, one can feel all sorts of things for it. But it can be difficult. I think it can be difficult. And I think telling the story of the difficulty is an important part of the story. Okay, one more question. I've been told one more question.
At the risk of using a rather tired internet trope.
Sorry, where are you? Oh, yeah, there you are. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
The trope is, I saw what you did. Mm-hmm. And this comment would make a whole lot more sense and have more resonance if I'd been able to put it in right after your last words. But your last words were sort of giving thanks to us, right?
Yes, and also asking you to make of it what you will.
Well, I think we got it. And I won't try to rephrase it in the Greek the way you did, but the thanks you gave is the thanks we have.
Nice. Right? Thanks. Yeah, we can stop here. Yeah, that's good.
Oh.